purpose in gathering today is to mark the 99th anniversary of the birth of Hamish Henderson, and we're particularly delighted to have Quetzal Henderson and other members of the family here today, so welcome. And it's my privilege to be able to welcome and to introduce Professor Gary West to give this year's lecture. Now, Gary is somebody who will be known to most of us, but in many different ways. He's a piper and composer. He's a tremendous supporter of young talent and of other artists. He's a teacher. He chairs tracks. He gets involved in helping with piping competitions, in teaching piping. But I think, above all, Gary is somebody who people respect and trust, somebody who's very much at the heart of that carrying stream of Scotland's tradition, and there's really nobody better to give this important lecture in the series as we approach Hamish's centenary on this rather special weekend. And his title picks up on that, Cognac no She, War or Peace, Hamish Henderson, Jock Duncan and the Voicings of War. Can you please welcome Professor Gary?
Cognac no She, War or Peace, or an approximation of a wee flavour of it at least. A piece of Kilmore, Pibroch, many centuries old, and traditionally it is said played on the eve of battle, or indeed in the heat of battle, and most famously of all, I think, by Kenneth Mackay, Piper Kenneth Mackay, who was from the Kyle of Tongue in Sutherland, a place I know well. My mother's people were all from there. And he was in the 79th Cavan Highlanders at Waterloo, and famously he stood or stepped outside the square of infantry. That was Wellington's preferred team lineup of the time, and played the tune, all of the tune, which must have taken him 15 or 20 minutes or so, which was either a very brave or very daft thing to do, or both perhaps. He survived, amazingly, unlike 2 years earlier, where in a different battle in the same campaign, the Gordons were doing the same thing, and it took a slightly macabre musical relay of 3 pipers to finish the tune, the first 2 being killed in the process. So a tune very much associated with war, sadly. I was in the fields of Waterloo earlier this year, actually, on a tour of the battlefields of France and Flanders with the Atholl Highlanders. Mainly the Western Front, First World War battlefields, but we took time out to go to Waterloo too. And when I mentioned and remembered, just on the spur of the moment, that story about Kenneth Mackay, one of my colleagues, fellow pipers in the Atholl Highlanders, Dr. Jack Taylor, a very, very fine interpreter of Pibroch, indeed a gold medalist in his day, struck up and played that tune. Must have been somewhere close to the spot where Kenneth Mackay had done so 203 years earlier. And it was, I have to say, a very moving, spontaneous act of remembrance. Cognac no She, War or Peace. Not Cognac is she, not war and peace, war or peace, suggesting perhaps there is a choice to be made there. All too often, of course, at the individual level, there's no choice. And in fact, that's shown in fragments of verses that have come down with that tune. I don't think we have a complete text, but we have a few verses. Here's one of them. Cognac no She, Scomalum, Cognac no She, Maravar sa Cognac, no Crocha and She me. Which means war or peace, they're alike to me, they're all the same to me. War or peace, I will be killed in the war or hanged in the peace. Slightly pessimistic view on life, perhaps, but we'll come back to that. Anyway, good afternoon. I'm very honoured indeed to have been asked to deliver this lecture in Hamish's memory this year. I think I've made most of them over the years, not all of them by any means, sadly, but most of them. And I recall, as some of you might, Owen Dudley Edwards' contribution to this series, and he started off by saying that it seems to be the done thing on these occasions when giving a lecture in someone's memory or someone's honour to proclaim one's relationship with that person, or indeed to apologise for not having had one. And as he said, he knew Hamish so well and they were so close they went 16 years without speaking to each other. So in that spirit, I don't think that happened as far as I know, but I did know Hamish, not as long or as well, I'm sure, as many of you here. But he was a significant intellectual and actual presence in my life from the age of 17 when I first came to Edinburgh. I found myself quite by accident doing a degree in the School of Scottish Studies. And then when I joined the staff there in 1994, Hamish was still an honorary fellow, still daily going up to his garret in 27 George Square, as he was for a few years after I started. So, but thinking back to when I first knew him when he was lecturing us in 27 George Square, I think I've referred before in print to Hamish's lecturing style as having been delightfully shambolic, which I meant as a very, very positive thing, incidentally. Invariably, he would ask us to remind him what he had been talking about yesterday. And when we told him, he would go back to the same starting point, which was usually Mrs. Brown of Falkland, I seem to remember. Well, I know, because I found my notebook recently of Hamish's lectures. But then he would proceed to take us somewhere else entirely that day, somewhere completely different. And there was no predicting where that might be. It might be to Germany before the war, with stories of his clandestine attempts to bring the ethnic enemies of fascism safely out of its hellish grip. Or to Rome, 1944, his discovery of the thinking of that giant wee Sardinian cripple, and how he had been determined to come home to put the philosophies of Antonio Gramsci into English and into action. Because one thing was very clear from the start, I noticed with Hamish, that he very firmly believed that folk song was a force for good in the world. He had a very strong conviction that it could bring peace out of war. Or he might then take us to the day he first knocked on the front door of Jeannie Robertson and was almost turned away until he sang to her wrongly, as she would have it. And so he knew she would have to take him in so she could teach it to him right. She did. Or maybe his musings may have taken us to his folk song flightings with Hugh MacDiarmid through the letters pages of the Scotsman, recounted to us with a toothless grin, a gentle shaking of the head, a flash of annoyance, or a straightening of his back in triumph as he recounted some of the verbal punches he felt he had landed square on that jutting Langham jaw. I think his favourite was his proclamation to Chris, as he always called him when he wasn't calling him Elias Michaelius, that by denigrating folk song and popular poetry today, you're kicking away from under you the ladder upon which you yourself rose to greatness. And I suppose if we recount some of MacDiarmid's early verses, we can see maybe where Hamish was coming from on that one without taking sides in the fighting. Think of maybe of The Empty Vessel, one of MacDiarmid's early poems, of course. I met a yont the cairney, alas, with toosey hair, singing till her bairnie, or was nae longer there. One of the most achingly tragic quatrains, actually, I can think of from MacDiarmid, certainly. So all of these things and many more were packed into the hours spent in Hamish's lectures in 27 George Square. And I saw later, not then perhaps, but later, that what he was doing was giving us the threads with which we could do the weaving ourselves. And as Frank Beckhofer, who's here, argued in his recent contribution to the series a couple of years ago, Hamish was a first-class educationalist, a highly skilled pedagogue and academic, amongst all the other things he was. He sowed long-term seeds, not for him the magic beans that are sometimes expected of us nowadays at higher education institutions, where the fruits are looked for overnight sometimes. So Hamish was fascinating, he was inspiring, he was like nothing or nobody I'd ever encountered before or since, come to think of it. So that's, there endeth my proclamation about Hamish's influence on me, but also why I'm very proud to be giving this lecture in his memory today. So, to my tale, war or peace. One thing I did definitely recognise at the time was that was a duality that was never far from Hamish's voicings and his teachings in those days to us in the 1980s. And it's a relationship, of course, as has already been mentioned by Donald, that's very much in the air this weekend in particular. 100 years ago, tomorrow morning, a railway carriage in a forest in Picardy was the setting for at least an official marking of the supposed move from one to the other, from war to peace. Whether anyone ever really believed it was the war to end wars, I have my doubts. But certainly it marked a rite of passage throughout the world, really, from one to the other at the time. Hamish, as Donald was saying, was not yet born, not yet quite conceived. I suppose that would be in another 3 months' time. If that's not too unsavoury a thought. He might by now have been a twinkling in an eye. Quite whose eye remains something of a teasing mystery for the rest of his life. And incidentally, as an Athol boy myself, I was of course intrigued about the idea that the eye which twinkled may just have belonged to Bardi, Marquis of Tullibardine, son and heir to the Duke of Athol and later Duke himself. And that indeed was another moving moment when we visited the battlefields of the Western Front with the Athol Highlanders this summer. We found the memorial to Bardi's younger brother, Lord George Murray, who had been killed in the Marne within days of arriving in France with the Black Watch in September 1914. Excuse me. And the present day Marquis of Tullibardine, a very fine, young, unassuming man, paid ceremonial tribute to his forebear, saluting him with Lord George's own sword, which had been returned to Blair Castle after his death. And there will be many such acts tomorrow, all around the world, some highly ceremonial, others much less so, in a series of rememberings. Several of us in this room will be part of one of them. Ian McCalman's Far Far From Ypres stage show at the Usher Hall tomorrow night, which we've been touring across the country over the last few weeks and months. And Ian's form of remembering is very gentle, it's very authentic in spirit, to me at least. It brings on, heading on 30 folky voices together in song, and for me a hugely powerful experience to be a part of it. It includes marching songs, trench songs, music hall hits of the day, as well as retrospective reflections by some of today's most skilled songmakers. One of the latter will be sung tomorrow night by the man who penned it, Jock Duncan, in a song which rejects the pomp and ceremony, actually, that I've just been describing, that we acted out in France with the Athol Highlanders. Childhood's End is a utopian vision of a time in the future when we will always choose peace over war. It is, I think, very much in the spirit of some of Hamish's own positive post-war voicings. Think of when we shall no longer drop to attention when our braggarts cruisely craw, or indeed when life triumphs over death in that particular fighting. Dick looks forward to a time when as a human race we will have come of age, left our daft childhoods behind, abandoned our petty playground squabblings, and when we will have quite simply grown up. Childhood's End, when we have just laid the last old soldier to rest, but without waving flags or beating drums or last post playing. And when a silent prayer was said by those who had something to pray to, while the rest of us joined hands and softly sang, and asked forgiveness from the dead for millennia of killing, for we knew now where the blame lay. But where did it lie? Is it always the fault of the politicians and the generals? Dick himself never shies away from pointing the finger at the likes of them. But I rather fancy in this case the answer is that the blame lies with all of us. We have to take collective responsibility for our war-torn childhood, and we must grow up together. The pride engendered by regimental tradition and ceremony is part of the problem. I think that's implied, indeed explicit, in Dick's song, for it only serves to prolong the triumph of war over peace. As always, Dick giving us lots of food for thought there. Another song which will be sung tomorrow night, this one by the wonderful Siobhan Miller, was written by Jim Malcolm. And I think all of us in the cast agree that this is a memorialisation of the Great War that is of the highest order in every respect, musically, poetically, emotionally. Breathtaking, I would say, in its everyday matter-of-fact simplicity. Jimmy's Gone to Flanders. That's both the title and the refrain. It's a straightforward, unembellished fact. Jimmy's gone to Flanders. The speaker is his mother, maybe talking to a neighbour, maybe just talking to herself or the walls or nobody in particular. She lives in Perthshire, somewhere on the River Erne, Crieff maybe, and Jimmy and his pals are away with the local regiment, the Black Watch. Jimmy's gone to Flanders. The fear of that fact, the pain of that fact is left unsaid, but it's there in the song, no doubt about it, simmering under the surface. But she has to stay on the surface. She can't let herself imagine, can't allow her mind to wander and wonder what he's doing, what it's like, what's to be his fate. So she does what mothers do, and she talks like mothers talk. He's a messy brat, he's away to Flanders and he's left his fiddle lying about, and it was his late father's fiddle. He's not cleaned his football boots, he's not sorted his fishing gear from the last time he was out, and he and Willie should never have been out that night anyway. There was no moonlight. How can you fish with no moonlight? But she can allow herself a wee peek into the future when Jimmy comes home, as she has to believe he will, to his fiddle and his mucky boots and to good fishing. Jimmy's gone to Flanders. His fiddle's lying on his bed. It was his father's fiddle, though he's aye been shy to practice it. Jimmy's gone to Flanders. His fishing creel's a tangle since the nicht he and Willie fished the Erne, though there wasn't a moon. Jimmy's gone to Flanders. He spiled the old dog rotten with scraps below the table, though I've told him time and time again. Jimmy's gone to Flanders. His football boots are sodden and they've no been near Dublin since they bought them new for Sandy Broon. When Jimmy's hame fae Flanders, he'll be shamed to clean the football boots and sort out all yon tangle, for the Erne I hear is fishing good. When Jimmy's hame fae Flanders, we'll all sit in round the table and we'll coax him to his fiddle. Jimmy, he's the Bono Highlanders. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, though he has a job at Logie's Yard, but all the lads were joining, it'll all be done by Christmas time. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, though he's no the strength his father was, but I ken he's worthy and that jockey would he burst with pride. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, I ken he is a lassie. Her father saw them walking by themselves below the falls of May. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, he's as secret as his father was, but I saw her weeping as the sergeant marched them to the train. When Jimmy's hame fae Flanders, he'll be shamed to clean the football boots and sort it all yon tangle, for the Erne I hear is fishing good. When Jimmy's hame fae Flanders, we'll all sitting round the table and we'll coax him to his fiddle. Jimmy, gaze the Bono Highlanders. You might notice Jim Malcolm has left the ending up to us. The text is the same each time it's told or listened to or sung or whatever, but we can fill in the end ourselves. Does Jimmy come home? Does he sit in by the table and give them the Bono Highlanders, or are his boots left uncleaned, his gear tangled, his fiddle silent, his widow broken hearted and his mother just broken? I suppose that's art we get to decide, mothers didn't. Anyway, staying in Perthshire, thinking back for a moment to the first time I met Hamish in the class in George Square, he was always keen to know where we were from. I think there was about 20 of us in the class, and he was going round, and he, especially for those of us from Scotland, there were visitors as well from overseas, he could always mention somebody in the community that we were from. He'd probably interviewed them. And I said I was from Pitlochry, and he said, you'll know of Jock Duncan then. And I did, and I do. And for the last number of months I've been working with the fruits of an amazing thing that Jock Duncan has done, a memorialisation of a kind, but not one which can be done on a single day. Rather one that he's been working on in one way or another virtually all his days, all of his life. And first of all, over a period of 50 years, Jock interviewed 59 veterans of the Great War, representing 25 battalions across 14 regiments. 33 of these were Gordon Highlanders. He's transcribed a lot in what is a beautiful, creative rendering of their language, a language Jock shares, and I've been editing it and helping to knock it into shape for publication. We finished it last week, I'm delighted to say. Should be out early next year. And some of you may have seen a wee play I've put together with 3 fine collaborators, which was designed to get these stories heard, Jock's jocks. I've been writing the introduction, so I'm borrowing from that, giving it a first airing now, if I may. Jock Duncan is an extraordinary, ordinary man. And I knew this long before I found out, around 3 or 4 years ago, about his lifetime's hobby of seeking out men who had fought in the Great War, recording their stories, transcribing them word for word in beautifully rich Scots on a small manual typewriter on 2,000 Sunday mornings. counted them all. I've known him all my days, having grown up in Pitlochry and Perthshire, just 2 years apart at school from his younger son Gordon, and I was taught the bagpipes from the age of 9 by his elder son Ian. And Jock and my dad would take turns driving Gordon and me to piping competitions, Jock sometimes opting for his old Volkswagen camper van that always smelled of colour gas and broth. I can smell it yet. Jock's wife Frances was a familiar voice for me too from a young age, and in later life I got to know their daughters, Frances Jr. and Moira. And Jock fascinated me from the off. His deep-rooted Doric tongue seemed impenetrable at first when I was wee, but soon grew familiar enough for me to at least catch the gist most of the time. And to this day I love listening to him talk and sing. I rather fancy his rich Buchan dialect has not been diluted in the slightest since the day he left his native northeast 7 decades ago. And yet my fascination ran much deeper than just the way he spoke. Even as a boy I recognised a gentle wisdom in him, although a wisdom always worn lightly. Our shared world, to begin with at least, was the world of piping. He had learned himself as a boy for a while, although of course it was song that was to become his own main thing in adult life. But in Ian and Gordon, he had 2 boys who were destined to become famous names in piping. Ian as a prolific teacher and one of the most respected pipe band leaders of his generation, and Gordon as an innovating genius whose compositions and unique, virtuosic style of playing opened up entire new directions for the art. All 3, Jock, Ian and Gordon, have been admitted to the Scottish Traditional Music Hall of Fame, the only family to date with 3 members thus honoured from a close family at least. Tragically, Gordon's honour was awarded posthumously, having died in 2005 at the age of just 41. And just as an aside, war or peace, as you may know, Gordon died by his own hand. And just so many of our young men and women, but mainly men, have that war going on in their minds that they find a certain kind of peace for, sadly. So maybe this weekend we're remembering different kinds of war, shall we say, different kinds of relationships between war and peace. Anyway, what struck me, excuse me, back then as a young boy was Jock's incredible depth of knowledge of the traditions of piping, of the repertoire and its history, and he was generous to a fault with his advice. "Tak it slowly, there's nae getting rushing it," he would say. By the time Gordon and I joined the local pipe band, the Vale of Atholl, in the 1970s, which Ian led, Jock was ever present for the first few years, helping out at Highland nights and competitions, and he was particularly in his element when we visited his native northeast on trips to Turra, Old Meldrum, Keith and Aberdeen, where he and Frances would help keep our bellies full in the camper van, serving up infinite bowls of broth and imploring us to tack some loaf. Our nights were spent in sleeping bags on the hard wooden floor of the Millbrecks village hall. I always loved that one. I was intrigued with that place name, Millbrecks. Kept by Jock's pal Harry Panton, a man who knew how to pour a generous dram, which I discovered at far too young an age. It was on these trips north and east that I began to understand a little of the world Jock had come from, the world he shared with most of the men whose stories he has gifted us. Born on the small farm of Gellybrae, near New Deer, Aberdeenshire, in 1925, so just 6 years after Hamish, there was music all around Jock from the start. His mother was a gifted pianist and was the accompanist of choice for the many fiddlers of the district and those for some miles to the southwest around Fyvie after the family moved there to the farm of South Farren Hill in 1928. Jock's brother Jimmy was himself a fiddler, taught by the great master of the slow strathspey, James F. Dickey, and he brought players and singers from all around to regular soirees in the house. Young Jock soaking up every nuance and syllable of the songs and ballads and cornkisters, and every phrase and inflection of the pipe and fiddle tunes. And South Farren Hill became what much further west would have been called the Tyke Cayley. The Cayley House, a key social and cultural hub of the local community, a gathering place for a grand splore, as they called it in the northeast. And Jock's sister Marion was a fine singer. Regular visitors included their father's cousin Charlie Duncan, a master of the bothy ballads, whose repertoire and style were a significant influence on the youthful Jock. And John Strachan, too, was no stranger to Farren Hill. This well-to-do farmer from Cricky, near Fyvie, was already becoming recognised as one of the great tradition bearers of Scottish folk song. The American collector James Madison Carpenter arriving at Cricky from Harvard with his wax cylinder recorder to capture something of John's art in 1930. Carpenter's was the first of a steady trail of academics and collectors to beat a path to John Strachan's door, including, of course, Hamish with Allan in 1951, who invited him to perform in the first Edinburgh People's Festival, Cayley, in August that same year, which of course often is credited as sparking the entire folk revival. Many, as we were just talking about earlier actually, many years later, Jock himself would perform at the 60th anniversary celebration of that seminal evening held in the same venue, the Oddfellows Hall, in 2011, that Paddy and myself and various others helped put together. So, there was no shortage of quality in the regular splores, Ben the Hoose in South Fadden Hill, and crucially, I think, from childhood, Jock had therefore been made aware of the concept of collecting. And music was deeply embedded in local life, but it didn't put the dinner on the table. It was working the soil that did that, and the farm had been in the possession of Jock's grandfather. So when Jock's father took it on in 1928, it was very much a family concern. Like most children in his situation, Jock was keen to learn the ways of the farm, taking on the role of oraloon, or apprentice, and he was comfortable driving a pair of horse behind a plough by the age of 10. And on leaving school at 14, he began to work full-time on South Fadden Hill, no doubt mixing with the older men all around the district at sales and marts, and on many occasions when neighbours helped each other with the tasks that needed more hands than most small holdings could supply themselves, such as when the travelling steam threshing mills came round. Many of these neighbours, of course, had fought in the Great War, and not a few still bore the scars to prove it. The year Jock left school, it started all over again. For many, there must have been a dreadful sense of déjà vu as they watched their sons lay down their ploughs, as they themselves had once done, swapping the parks of Buchan for these same fields of France. And for women of Jock's mother's generation, whose lives were punctuated by at least 3 major conflicts, beginning with the Boer War, then the sentiments later to be penned by Judy Small would have rung true indeed, I'm sure. The first time it was fathers, the last time it was sons, and in between your husbands marched away with drums and guns that you never thought to question, you just went on with your lives, for all they taught you who to be was mothers, daughters, wives. At 18, Jock himself followed on, joining the Royal Air Force in 1943 and soon finding himself in France for the final 2 years of this latest world conflict. And although he talks little of it, no doubt the experience gave him some insight into the psyche of war, of killing and loss, of military rules and traditions, of the humour and camaraderie. It was an experience he was to put to good use in his very knowledgeable and very empathetic style of interviewing that's fueled his collection of stories. After the war, Jock returned to farm work in the northeast, where he met and married Frances, and where Ian, Moira, young Frances and Gordon arrived in turn. But farming was changing, tractors were replacing horses, mechanisation in general was reducing the need for human labour, and Jock was one of thousands of his generation who turned to new ways. One of these new ways was the quest to produce enough electricity to power the recovery from war. Of course, since 1943, hydro schemes had started to be built across the nation, a massive project led by the Secretary of State for Scotland and first chair of the Hydroelectric Board, Tom Johnson. Jock and Frances took the decision to embrace this new life, following the work offered within the hydro. Leaving farming in their native county, they moved the family first to Caithness, then later to Pitlochry, where they settled for the rest of their days. Frances sadly passed away there last year, and Jock, now 93, lives there still. So, well known as he is, and despite being such a natural, outgoing performer on stage, Jock is also a naturally modest man, one given to playing down his own achievements. I think it's very telling that very few people knew he was even collecting these stories, these memories. I remember Gordon once saying to me he thought his father was learning to type. And Francis Jr. can testify that it was with one finger at a time, from one hand only. And Gordon later mentioned to me he thought it was maybe a book of some kind his father was working on, but didn't know any details. And Ian tells me he knew almost nothing about this till Jock presented him with the full set of typed transcripts in 2014. And when I asked Jock what motivated him to begin collecting these men's stories, he played it down. Well, I was just newsing with the neighbours, Ken. And that indeed seems to be how it started. He says he started in the 1930s. He must have still been in his teens. It began, it would seem, with casual chats with neighbouring men You can maybe imagine this inquisitive young loon dropping the odd question into the conversation as they fought oats together into the threshing mill or lifted tatties one October. Perhaps as the country headed for war once again, Jock realised it might be his own turn soon. Maybe a concerned curiosity led him to seek out some sense of what it was like. Or maybe the neighbouring men themselves began to drop the odd aside into their musing, as renewed talk of war made it all come flooding back. But whatever the immediate motivation, Jock got them talking. In the early years, he would return home, write their stories down from memory, and some wrote them down for him, but the bulk of his collecting was carried out much later, in the 60s and 70s, the conversations mainly being recorded onto cassette tape. And Jock was a skilled collector. He knew the importance of background and context, and although he was mainly interested in the war, he took time to begin all of his interviews by asking the men about their backgrounds, where they had come, and so on. So the opening chapters of the book, Jock really allows us to use the men's words to paint a picture of life in the countryside of northeast Scotland and Perthshire and Angus in the lead up to the outbreak of war in 1914. Of course, there are other representations of that time and place. We think of Lewis Grassic in Sunset Song, or the various histories as well of the time. Think of Ian Carter's farm life in northeast Scotland, for example. But Jock's veterans were, of course, the real-life equivalents of Lang Rab of the Mill and J. Strachan and Ewan Tavendale, although there's few insights here into the experiences of Chris Guthrie and her like. This collection is very much about the local men who went off to fight. It's unashamedly masculine in its focus, and yes, mothers, daughters and wives are in their minds at times when recounting their stories, and there's certainly a marked recognition of the anguish of their waiting and the pain of their loss. Here's Sergeant Alec Robertson of the 5th Gordon Highlanders. I had a cousin in the Gordon Highlanders blown to pieces. When I was home on leave, I went up to see his mother in New Deer to offer my condolences, and she showed me a photograph of his grave. I didn't say anything. It's what makes me sad for the mothers. None of the dead were buried in a real grave, but just on the battlefield. But overwhelmingly, it's the story of life in the fields of rural Scotland, the trenches of Belgium and France, and the shores of Gallipoli, as experienced and recalled by the menfolk, jocks. To be a farmer, or a farm worker at least in lowland Scotland in the early 20th century, was to be a ploughman, and to be a ploughman was to be a horseman. And that intimate connection between a cavalryman and his horse, which is of course so movingly captured in Marpurgo's War Horse, replicates the sentiments expressed by many of the men interviewed by Jock too. Several recall the occasion when 5 healthy shalts or ponies were recruited at the church in Fyvie in 1914. There's this Private Dodd Carroll he joined the Gordon Highlanders and was then transferred to the Machine Gun Corps. The army come round the ferns and commandeered ony horses they were fancying. I mind when they came to Fyvie Kirk on Sunday service and took the good shots that was there that day. Of course there was plenty of shots and gigs, that's all there was at the time, you ken. And for John Rennie of the 5th Gordon Highlanders, who saw so many of his friends lose their lives during the conflict, it's the memory of his two of his working horses that seemed to bring him closest to tears when recounting it to Jock. I got a letter for him, he was out in France at the time, I got a letter for him saying my guid pair of horse, a roch before I gaed a war, had been commandeered by the army. I just could near he grattan when I read that. Great past participle of Scots, that grattan, when I read that. In the letter my mother speered if I would look out for them. There was no much chance of that. Well, recruiting horses was one thing, recruiting men was quite another. Only a few of those interviewed by Jock were already full-time regular soldiers by the time war broke out in August 1914, serving in regiments which constituted part of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. That had been set up as a result of the Haldane reforms of the army in the first decade of the 20th century. The aim was to establish a well-trained force of full-time soldiers capable of contributing to any potential major war within Europe. By 1914 it constituted around 250,000 men, commanded by Sir John French, and including some 20,000 or so members of 22 Scottish regiments. At the outbreak of war, only 3 of these were stationed at home in Scotland. There were the 1st Cameron Highlanders, the 1st Cameronians, and the 2nd Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. 8 more were in England or Ireland, the rest were overseas, principally in India. So it was the UK-based regiments of the BEF who first arrived in France in August 1914. But by At the end of the year, most, including the Scottish contingent, had travelled back to take their place on the Western Front. And while a few of the men Jock interviewed were regular professional soldiers, or had recently served as such and remained as reservists and were therefore called up, there were many others who had already joined the Terriers by the time war was declared, the Territorial Force, which had been set up in 1908 as an extra line of home defence. Here's Albert Connon of Turriff. He said, "I joined the Terriers at Turra with a lad called Jimmy Finney. He was 16, I was 17. That was in February 1914. We were Fiat at Hare Moss at the time. When we come out of the drill hall after joining, Jimmy says to me, 'What will we do if there's a war?' I just looked at him and we both laughed. Another good past participant, laugh. We both laughed, but it was a prophetic question. Of course, within 6 months, Albert and Jimmy were on their way to the Western Front. For the Terriers, the territorials of the rural northeast, the call to arms was highly memorable because it came during one of the key festivals and social highlights of the farming year. At that time, Aberdeen got off for the Turra show. I was in the Terriers and was told to report to the drill hall by our sergeant. He was going round the show telling other lads that war had been declared. So I gave him from a kit. That was me for the duration. That was John Rennie again of the 5th Gordons. So while John Rennie and his Terrier colleagues were obliged to report for duty under the terms of their service, for most of Jock's men their first encounter with military culture and authority would come when they responded to Kitchener's pointing finger and headed voluntarily to the recruiting offices across the northeast. The BEF was well trained, highly professional, but far too small for the scale of war that was emerging. So the challenge was on, of course, to recruit, train and deploy a much larger fighting force in a matter of weeks. Kitchener was the first serving soldier to be appointed to cabinet since the 17th century, but he didn't like the territorials for some reason. He distrusted them and opted instead to create a network of special service battalions attached to the regular full-time regiments of the army right across the nation, the Palace regiments. Setting out to recruit 100,000 volunteers, his Your Country Needs You poster campaign that we all know must surely be one of the most successful marketing projects in history, as young men from shipyards, factories, transport depots, professional football teams, virtually every walk of life, responded enthusiastically and volunteered to fight in the new army, and the farming folk of the northeast were no different. I joined up with my pal Fred Duncan after the leaflets came out from Kitchener needing 100,000 men. We bike it with a lot more from Millbrecks to Peterhead to join up in the 5th Gordons. We was teen Richtewa to do our training and get out to France from Bedford in the spring of 1915. Fred was teen with a lot of other volunteers to the newly formed Machine Gun Corps that year, but he was killed in the storm. That was Sandy Simpson of Woodhead, 5th Gordon Highlanders. Others testified to the fact that there were around 30 farm servants who cycled the 25 or so miles together from Millbrecks to Peterhead that day. It must have been quite a sight, what I think of as a peloton of ploughmen. Some local farmers tried to confiscate the posters, incidentally. A few of them mentioned that, understandably worried that they would lose their workforce, but it was an ineffective ploy. There was no holding them back. And the numerous stories of recruitment and volunteering collected by Jock generally follow the same grand narrative which applies throughout the nation. What comes through very strongly is the eagerness for them to join up, to go, to get involved, to do their bit. There's an edge of excitement there, almost a levity, as these men, reflecting back, of course, much later in life, recall their youthful enthusiasm at the start of the great adventure. Several lads admitted to Jock they had lied about their age. Robert Moore of the 4th Seaforth Highlanders being just one of an estimated 250,000 boys in the British Army who fought in the Great War underage. He said, "I was in the Terriers at Perth with their Black Watch Battalion. I was mustered when war started. I went to my officer and I told him I wanted back to my own lot in the Black Isle. I was granted my wish and sent back up north to join the Seaforth Highlanders. At that time still at Nig. I was 14 years old. We went there, from there to Inverness and stayed there a while, then later entrained for Bedford Camp. We were sent to France in October 1914, joined the 1st Corps, 1st Division, 3rd Brigade. As I went off in 1914, when I was 14, my folks tried to get me home a few times. I always refused when I was called in front of the CO. I suppose I liked it, though it was rough at times." Whatever their age, when the volunteers arrived onto the fields of Belgium and France, the realities of war kicked in very quickly. Jock while his interviews comprise detailed and often graphic accounts of the experiences of these men in virtually all of the main theatres of war on the Western Front and in Gallipoli. In almost every case, their stories are told in a rather matter-of-fact manner, with little attempt to add further to the drama, often with a humour that on first reading may seem surprising. Violent death, of course, was a daily occurrence. Many of the men represented were wounded, some of them several times over, and yet there's very little evidence of bitterness and almost no politically infused questioning of the reasons why they were there in the first place. In fact, one of the few hints of protest contained in the narratives comes from Alec Robertson of the 5th Gordon Highlanders. When recalling the words of his new commanding officer who had replaced the highly popular Lieutenant Colonel Grant, Grant had lost an arm to a shell explosion. Colonel MacTaggart came after Grant. He was a wee man who came from the Lancers. When we came out of the psalm, he addressed us and said that it was an honour to die for our country. I don't think we appreciated that. I'm sure Alec would have agreed with Wilfred Owen's own rejection of that old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Talking of Wilfred Owen, it is my contention that there are deep poetics embedded in the narratives of many of Jock's jocks. When Ian handed me the typed manuscript for the first time, I opened it at a random page. The very first extract I read was this. In 1914, we went out to meet the Germans in no man's land. Christmas Day, 1914. We got on great. We swapped presents and fags and that. I gave a lad a tin of McConaughey's and he gave me a brown loaf, but I didn't care for it. Both sides took the opportunity to collect the dead bodies. My, that certainly was no picnic. Some of them were just in bits and had to be collected into bags, and the stink beat hell. That was Jimmy Reid from Afford of the 6th Gordons, a man who knew how to craft a memorable line or two, even just in his off-the-cuff remembering for Jock. Or Jim Smith of the Royal Field Artillery. This ship we go to Egypt with was called the Kinstonia. I mind that. We disembarked at Alexandria and into camp, and there we waited for the New Zealanders and Australians to come for their own countries. And when that happened, we got into our same ships and sailed for Lemnos. A whole fleet of them congregated there with a lot of battleships and all, and on the 24th of April 1915, we set sail for the shores of Gallipoli. I mind it was an awful fine night. The stink beat hell, and it was an awful fine night. I think it's these little details in the story that kind of take us right there. Incidentally, in the Jock's play, we use that last extract from Jim Smith. And the character, which we've acted out on this stage a couple of times, known just as the young lad, is reading Jock's collection and comes across the chapter in Gallipoli, and he says, I mind doing that stuff at school, but I thought it was the New Zealanders and the Australians who were mainly at Gallipoli. And the Anzacs, he's told, aye, they were there, but there were plenty of Jocks there too. And then we do the roll call. 87th Brigade, 1st Kings on Scottish Borders. 88th Brigade, 5th Royal Scots, 52nd Lowland Division, 155 Brigade, 4th Royal Scots Fusiliers, 5th Royal Scots Fusiliers, 4th Kings on Scottish Borders, 5th Kings on Scottish Borders, 156 Brigade, 4th Royal Scots, 7th Royal Scots, 7th Scottish Rifles, 8th Scottish Rifles, 157 Brigade, 5th Highland Light Infantry, 6th Highland Light Infantry, 7th Highland Light Infantry, 5th Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, 2nd Mounted Division, 1st Scottish Horse, 2nd Scottish Horse, 3rd Scottish Horse. It's much easier when you're allowed to read it out, actually. Scottish Horse, incidentally, being commanded by none other than Bardi. Same man. Taking us right there, in his case, in the next war, of course, was a gift Hamish had too. At one of his lectures in the 80s, he handed us each a signed copy of his elegies for the dead in Cyrenaica. And on revisiting these poems, I see some strong echoes of that understated yet straight to the point style of lyrical storytelling shared with some of Jock's jocks. I'd never heard of Cyrenaica, part of eastern Libya, of course, and a central focus of the North African campaign in which Hamish played his part. So Hamish's war poems, composed between March 1943 and December 1947 in, as he said, North Africa, Italy and Scotland, comprise one of the key poetic texts of the World War, Second World War in this case, of course, as has been discussed in several of these annual lectures before. So I just want to touch on this briefly. As his friend, the pacifist poet and writer Adrian Mitchell reminds us, Hamish writes about war as war, of life-size or death-size real men, and the dead from both sides are mourned, for as a captured German officer remarked to Hamish, Africa changes everything. In reality, we are allies, and the desert is the common enemy. And it was that observation which lit the spark for the whole collection, which has at its heart two sets of fundamental relationships, men versus desert, and dead versus living. And both stalls are set out clearly in his first elegy, End of a Campaign. There are many dead in the British desert who lie uneasy in this landscape of half-wit, stunted ill will. For the dead land is insatiate and necrophilous, the sand is blowing about still. There were our own, there were the others. Their deaths were like their lives, human and animal. There were no gods and precious few heroes. So it was a place for surviving or dying and little else. And that in the desert it was the land that was the main enemy, is not in doubt. It is, as Hamish says, brutish, stunted, insatiate, necrophilous, also razor-sharp, malevolent, bomb-thumped, impartial, hostile. But perhaps worse than that, it was also mind-bending, its vastness and directionless form, creating what Hamish later called this odd effect of mirage and looking-glass illusion, which became for him a symbol of our human civil war, in which the roles seem constantly to change and the objectives to shift and vary. So the conventional concept of enemy, those you were trying to kill, was an ambiguous and confusing one within that landscape. For in those struggles between man and desert, or living and dead, British and German were on the same side. And that accounts for the mood of the 9th elegy from Hamish, which tells the story of the poet or narrator noticing a soldier contemplating the grave of a fallen enemy. His thought was like this: here's another good Jerry, poor mucker, just 18, must be hard up for manpower, or else he volunteered, silly bastard. That's the fatal mistake, never volunteer for nothing. I wonder how he died. Just as well it was him though, not one of our chaps. Yes, the only good Jerry, as they say, is your sort, chum. Cheerio, you poor bastard. Don't be late on parade when the Lord calls close order. Keep waiting for the angels. Keep listening for Reveille. But Reveille, of course, won't come. For as the next poem starkly reminds us, he and thousands like him are not sleeping, but dead. And then Hamish's 7th elegy was titled Seven Good Germans. They'd come to the desert with Rommel and never gave a thought to a place like El Eliba. To get to it, you had to drive into the blue, take a bearing and head for Damol. Still, of some few who did cross our path at El Eliba, there are 7 who died under their standing crosses, and then were taken through another roll call of just who they were. The first was a lieutenant who had jotted in his notebook, "Keep me steadfast." The second was a corporal who was fed up with his comrades griping about their rations. The third, a farmhand in the March of Silesia, but now himself fresh fodder. The fourth, a lance jack who had trusted in Adolf. The fifth was a mechanic who had one single headache, which was how to get back to his sweetheart. The sixth was a Pole, not a bad bloke. The 7th was a young squaddy, riding cramped in a lorry to death along the road which winds eastward to Hafaya. 7 poor bastards dead in Africa, dead land. So that sense of being at one with the so-called enemy that comes through very, very strongly in Hamish's poetry is a feeling that also comes through strongly, I think, in the words and stories of Jocks too. Here's one. We get out of the top at Bullecoop. I was on a three-man machine gun team. My pal Glendinning got winded and gave a wall back. Shortly after that, the other lad got it in the head and gave fair daft. So that was me, left on my own. I was looking for somebody to make up a team for the Cameron of Jerry, hanging on the barbet weir, the barbed wire, hanging on the barbet weir with both his arms blown off. I had a lad to give me a hand, and we got the pair lad away, and I war with the stretcher bearers. It's a funny thing, the Jerry I had on their big coats, summer and winter, from the winter night. That was Jimmy Milne of Rosehearty of the 2nd Gordons. Here's Albert Connan for Turra, 5th Gordons. At the back of the 3rd Wipers, we got out of the top. A lad for Cummiston was we me, but fell down deep before we got very far. Another lad and me at ain seemed to be on our ain, who had gone further forward than the lave and the rest. Then 2 Germans raised up and gave themselves up, and the 4 of us sat down in a shell hole and had a news as best we could. This one, the Pals regiments, all from the same area. I think this one brings it home perhaps better than most. When we attacked at High Wood in the Somme, the German weir was a hail. The wire was unbroken. We were losing an half a men. I flap it and keep it my heat down. There was another lad at my side and he raised up to get a perkin. I says to him, didn't you do that? Keep your heat down into the ground. But nah, he raised up and shot off a round. But nae more. That was him, finished. Now, after the war, I was doing a bit of courting with a lassie that's now my wife. Each time she showed me the photograph of her brother that was killed in the war, I said, I ken far about this lad was killed. He was lying beside me at High Wood. It was John Rennie. Again, who was from Balmerry Farm, Turriff, 5th Gordon. So, what Jock's lifetime's work has gifted us is many dozens of hours of first-hand personal testimony of those who were there. It runs to heading on 100,000 words of remembering, I suppose. We hear of mud, shells, trenches, truce, gas, razor-sharp barbet weir and razor-sharp hens on frozen tilts, horses, fighters, lice, laughs, the wounded, the diseased, dysentery and death. And yet these men shared one amazing thing in common, as we say in the play. They all came home. So Hamish Henderson and Jock Duncan, born 6 years and a couple of counties apart, have much in common. They both knew the taste of war, used the weapons of war, but their common weapons of peace were many things: determination, foresight, creativity, empathy, and the tape recorder. And of course, the making or singing of songs. And these are the stuff of peace, and are very fine things indeed. So tomorrow we remember now, maybe we can just toast Hamish Henderson and Jock Duncan.